to theological, political, and geographical reasons, we have this division in the church, and the two never really get back together, ever. And then, of course, post-Protestant Reformation, that kind of ecumenical council doesn't exist, it's not an existing thought. However, we in Oregon, you will often, where you may have, I shouldn't say you often, you might have heard of things like EMO, Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. You've heard that term before. And that's taking this concept of ecumenism in a different direction, because it's thinking of ecumenism as it relates to the plurality of denominations. Okay, before I get too far astray, let's talk a little bit of terminology, because I think this is the fun part. So, when we talk about the ancient church councils, there's a division that exists, besides the division of the Great Schism, but there's a way in which you kind of demarcate ancient church councils from ecumenical councils. And basically the division is Roman Empire. So Constantine actually convenes the first ecumenical council, the first worldwide council. And in fact, there are 7 recognized ancient or historical ecumenical councils, which I can list out later, that are recognized basically across the board-ish by Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox. And those occur between the 4th century and the 6th century Common Era. And each one of those ecumenical councils is effectively all of Christianity being represented. But again, one of the things I would point out is each one of those councils is not convened by the bishopry. It is convened by the empire. Okay, it is convened by well, we would term it secular government that has now gotten its fingers into Christianity, which we'll talk about. The councils that happened before that are not considered ecumenical, and where we're getting ecumenical from is the Greek word oikumene, which we derive ecumenical. And what oikumene means, just the whole thing, the whole world, all of it, in a nutshell. So, when the church convenes ecumenical councils, we're basically saying this is the council of everybody. The councils that happened before Constantine, before the first council of Nicaea, are just termed synodos or synod, which again, you will recognize that term. So we call our regional governing body of the church the Oregon Synod. There are 66 synods in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is coincidental because that's how many books there are in the Bible. I don't know if that was intentional or accidental, but good on us. The word synod comes from the Greek word synodos, which actually comes from syn hodos. And you will recognize this word if you're reading John 14, when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. It is te hodos, the way. So syn hodos means the same way. We're going a similar way. So when we have a synod gathering, what we're saying is we're convening a group of people that are going the same direction together, going the same direction together. Synod is the term that is applied to the ancient church councils, so all of the gatherings that happened pre-Constantine, so pre-First Council of Nicaea. And there's many of them. Now, I already mentioned the first one in practice is the Ancient Council of Jerusalem. Let me pull up my Bible, which is mentioned in Acts 15. So, if you would open up your Bibles, turn to Acts 15. 221 if you're using the Blue Lutheran Study Bibles. And the Council of Jerusalem is unique in that it is the only quote-unquote apostolic council. Okay? As we get councils that are convened after this, which we refer to as synods or synodos, those are councils that are convened in specific regions of Asia Minor and are, have regional interests. Okay? But those are all convened by, post life of the apostles. So they're convened by bishops in the church. This is the only council that we have which is convened not by a representative body of the church, but by the apostles themselves. And so we call it the apostolic council. I'll just read through it. Then certain individuals came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. And after Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and debate with them, Paul and Barnabas and some of the others were appointed to go up to Jerusalem to discuss this question with the apostles and the elders. So they were sent on their way by the church, and they passed through both Phoenicia and Samaria, and they reported a conversion of the Gentiles and brought great joy to all the brothers and sisters. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and the elders, and they reported all that God had done with them. But some believers who belonged to the sect of the Pharisees stood up and said, "It is necessary for them to be circumcised in order to keep the law of Moses." The apostles and the elders met together to consider this matter. After there had been much debate, Peter stood up and said to them, "My brothers, you know that in the early days God made a choice among you, that I should be the one through whom the Gentiles would hear the message of the good news and become believers. And God, who knows the human heart, testified to them by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us. And in cleansing their hearts by faith, he has made no distinction between them and us. Now, therefore, why are you putting God to the test by placing on the neck of the disciples a yoke that neither our ancestors nor we have been able to bear? On the contrary, we believe that we will be saved through the grace of the Lord Jesus, just as they will." The whole assembly kept silence and listened to Barnabas and Paul as they told all the signs and wonders that God had done through them among the Gentiles. After they finished speaking, James replied, "My brothers, listen to me. Simeon has related how God first looked favorably on the Gentiles to take from among them a people for his name. This agrees with the word of the prophets, as it is written, 'After this I will return, and I will rebuild the dwelling of David, which has fallen from its ruins. I will rebuild it, and I will set it up, so that all other peoples may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles over whom my name has been called. Thus says the Lord, who has been making these things known from long ago.' Therefore, I have reached the decision that we should not trouble those Gentiles who are turning to God, but we should write to them to abstain only from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, and from whatever has been strangled, and from blood. For in every city, for generations past, Moses had those who proclaim him, for he has been read aloud every Sabbath in the synagogues." Okay, so the first church council is dealing with who's in and who's out. And specifically, when the text mentions brothers, it's referring to apostles, to disciples, who have been, drawing this division amongst the early Christian community, saying, if you want to be Christian, you have to do the Jewish things. Okay? We just got finished reading about this, right? This is in Galatians, this is in Corinthians, this is in all these early texts, and Romans as well too. We know that this is the kind of the primary division between. Sorry, I gotta check my volume level here. Primary division that exists early in the church. So the first church council ever called is to address that. And to be fair, this is going to be the theme going forward in terms of why these councils are convened. They are convened specifically to deal with divisions within the church. In this case, like a true church council, they compromise. The issue is that many are saying, no, in order to be Christian, you have to do the things. And they compromise in that they say, well, no, you don't have to be circumcised. However, There are these certain, food cleanliness rituals that we think you should hold to, which is why 2,000 years later, you will have political bodies in the church who arguably will say, we don't hold this council to be official. And in practice, we Lutherans don't. We don't abstain from blood, right? I've eaten blood pudding. It's not my favorite, but it's a thing, I think, I don't know. The sexual immorality runs up in the air. I don't eat things polluted by idols. Well, sometimes I do, I suppose. Depending on your definition of what an idol is. I too have watched the Super Bowl. But this is the thing, right? When we talk about these church councils, especially as we go through them, one by one, you'll find that our modern governing church bodies will point back and say, well, we agree with this one, we don't agree with that one. That one's informative, that one's not, that one's official, that one's not. And this is just the way that it is. So one of the things that I hope that you keep in mind as we go through here is we're not actually talking about this is now the modern polity of the church because it happened so long ago. This is the history of the evolution of polity within the church. This is the history of the evolution of theology within the church. Because, again, as we get all the way up to 1054 in the Great Schism, one of the big issues at hand is the filioque, right? The from the question, which we'll talk about later. Again, as we study through this, I don't want you to think that these are all necessarily things that we have to incorporate into our modern worldview, but I think it's really important that we think and talk about it. And it's going to be fun. We're going to talk about a lot of different heresies and why they weren't important or informative in that context. Sound great? Yeah. We just got done reading Acts 15, talking about the Council of Jerusalem. We talked about ecumene, right, as ecumenical, so all the councils that are convened post-Constantine being the ecumenical councils, and synodos as walking together in the same road. Okay. Let's talk ancient ones. Questions? Comments?
I need to be totally off base, and I'm sure you'll let me know if I am.
You're off base.
What I read about Constantine was that he brought this council together, and that there was great chaos and differences in opinions, and that he mandated how people needed to vote, and therefore they did. Is that right or wrong?
Well, yeah. It is right, and it's complicated. One of the kind of the way in which the way in which I almost said Palpatine. Well, there's some interesting comparison there, but the popular understanding of Constantine as being responsible for making Christianity official is true and not true. It's more complicated than that. If you're asking me, my take on Constantine is very cynical. Constantine was a man of power and wealth and understood the value of symbols in inspiring both the military but inspiring cohesion amongst the people. Constantine is doing his thing during a time of great division within the Roman Empire. We're essentially watching the dissolution of leadership post-Tetrarchy, right, where it essentially dissolves into a civil war within the empire. And Constantine seizes upon Christianity as a uniting symbol. What that means post reunification of the empire, post that conflict, is that now Christianity is no longer ignored. Though, when we are talking about early church history, another misconception is this idea that from AD 30 all the way up through AD 400, Christians are just being rounded up and persecuted en masse. When the reality is that persecution is localized and occasional. So Christians, because Christianity doesn't grow and thrive otherwise. And which is evidenced by the fact that you have these ancient councils. You have churches plural, convening gatherings publicly in various locations, right? And a lot of that depends on who's emperor at the time and where they're doing it. And again, they're not, this is not the era of, public media or social media. So it's not like the emperor is finding out because people posted pictures from the convention on Facebook, right? So word is slow to travel. But to answer your question directly, what the value of Constantine in supporting Christianity is mixed, I would say. In that I don't know. Constantine affects the bureaucratic organization of Christianity, right? So you get Christianity, which before this did not have a centralized leadership. I mean, you have bishops who are representing their church and their region, and are kind of convening to decide who's, what's in, what's out in terms of theology. But there's no centralized figure that is the bishop, the pope, although Catholics may articulate differently about that. Post-Constantine, leadership of the church is centralized in the state, effectively. Wherein, now the state has its thumb on the scale in terms of who's doing what, and has the final say ultimately on who's in and who's out. And this is why, also, in these seven ecumenical councils that we're going to talk about, you get a lot of de facto decisions that are being made, which are really kind of reaffirming previous decisions. So, like, we're going to talk about the canonization of Scripture, right? Which traditionally we point to two different councils as being responsible for that, but effectively the canonization of Scripture already existed by like 250 Common Era, like in terms of how the majority of churches acknowledged what was canon, right? What was usable. So, like, yeah, Constantine gets credit for it. It's a mixed bag, in my opinion. I think there's a lot of positive stuff. I don't know that Christianity, as we understand it nowadays, exists without that. However, I think that we shifted the focus in Christianity away from the way, away from the synod, away from the common life together, and into a much more hierarchical, not that there's always anything wrong with hierarchy, but a much more hierarchical political body, which might have been inevitable. I don't know, this is conjecture at this point, right?
Is Constantine the one that supposedly didn't become a Christian until his deathbed?
I'd say he never became a Christian. I think his mom did. Yeah, mom. I think mom was all in. St. Helen, after which my wife is named. She was all on board. We can thank St. Helen for the majority of our holy sites. That was her mission, was to consecrate and sanctify the holy sites of Christianity, including the inn in Bethlehem and the Golgotha, or Church of the Holy Sepulchre. What is it? Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So.
That's his wife.
No, it's his mom.
His mom.
Mom, yeah.
Moms know best.
Yeah. But Constantine, I think, always and only saw it as a power base. Yeah. I don't know, but only God knows what's in the hearts of these people. So
where did the first bishops come from?
Well, that's an interesting question. They themselves. So the term bishop kind of just organically grows out of the need for leadership within the church, and so bishops effectively become those who are taking responsibility for a collection of gatherings within their local region, right? Because keep in mind, early church, there's not official buildings. These are, by and large, home gatherings, right? And so, I don't know if this is a good metaphor now. Whatever. Okay, we'll go with it. So Baptist churches in America, right, are responsible, are formed because of immigrant waves migrating across the Great Ocean into this new world. Okay? One of the interesting things about these early Baptist congregations is that they are heavily congregationally governed, meaning that they don't want nobody telling them what to do. Okay, contrasted with other mainline denominations like Lutherans, Methodists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, who, when they get over here, off their ships, set up their churches in their little areas, are immediately communicating with neighboring, congregations to try and, convene some kind of, governance together. The Baptists are like, no, don't tell us what to do. However, there's the question of how do we get pastors, right, other than raising them out of our own church, and how do we pool resources collectively? So the Baptist church, the Baptist denominations, the Anabaptist denominations have what's called triennial convention in early Christian history, which is all the Baptist churches in effectively New England, which later comes to include the South in the 13 colonies, convene a gathering every 3 years to, drink coffee and
Put women in their place.
yeah, and put women in their place.
Keep
Yeah.
people.
Well, Paul's saying that, but it's not
serious.
It's not serious, yeah. Well, and especially because the Southern Baptist Convention is formed as effectively a rebellion against the Triennial Convention over the inclusion of freed slaves into the churches. The Southern Baptists said, no thanks. Which, largest mainline Protestant denomination in America. It's another story. So, my comparison is the way that leadership springs up out of early Christianity is out of necessity, right? Which is, we have these gatherings in homes, and it's like, we used to do, and still do to a certain extent, circle groups within here. And occasionally I would get somebody saying, hey, we were talking about this in our circle the other day, can you give us some insight as to, we were reading this book of the Bible. And so I would say, well, here's what I think, and you can read more about it. That's what early bishops were doing, by and large. It's like, you've got congregations, communities that are meeting in homes, and they're like, hey, we're dealing with this question, and so you need somebody that's just is the decision maker. But bishops are early on, like first century, you've got people being identified as bishops, which I guess is ultimately the short answer to your question. Does that help? Okay. Paul.
You probably didn't cover it. I was going to ask, did you say anything about the vagueness of church authority before Constantine?
Oh, yeah.
It's not clear to us even which branch of, who's got the scriptures, right? Who's got the more original documents of...
Yes.
Even if you ask, who's got a Septuagint?
Yeah.
No,
we don't. We can't afford one.
Right.
So Paul asked when we talk about the vagueness of authority or leadership before Constantine. And this is going to be a theme we are going to encounter over and over and over and over again. Because keep in mind, before Constantine, when we have the synodos, when we have these synods that are gathering, they're regional. Meaning that they are not a representative body of Christianity en masse. They are not oikumene. They are not ecumenical. They are dealing with problems in a specific region. So what you may get is this might be a city, right? And the churches, the communities within that city. You might get several cities. You might get, bishops of several different regions that are gathering. Later on in Africa, we get quite a few, in Carthage specifically, we get quite a few not Carthage. Yeah, Carthage, yeah. I'm confusing Carthage and Corinth. Corinth is in Greek, Carthage.
Pretty different.
We get several councils of Carthage. In fact, there's like 5, 6, or 7 just councils of Carthage that happen. Because this ends up being kind of a hotbed for these kind of leadership conventions. And Africa is a little bit further from Rome than maybe Asia Minor is. If that helps. But as an example, one of the questions that arises is when is Easter? Is one of the early disputes. It's still disputed, right? So, and for us, mainline Protestantism and Catholicism, we identify Easter as the first Sunday after the first full moon after the vernal equinox. First day of spring. Eastern Orthodox Church, it is tied to Passover. Still, one of the early conflicts. Now I have to look it up. I can't remember what council. I think it might be the first council of Carthage, is where this is discussed. Is there's a scattering of churches somewhere over in Asia Minor that are holding Easter on the full moon of Passover, and it's so passive aggressive. The amount of passive aggressivity and triangulation that's going on in early churches, flabbergasting. Where some churches complain to their local bishop that they heard that this community is doing Easter on the full moon of the Passover. We've been doing it on the Sunday after Passover. And so they end up convening the First Council of Carthage in part to tell those churches to do it the right way. This is pretty representative of it. They're also doing Montanism on the side, just that little heresy, you know. But this is the kind of thing. So when we talk again about the idea of ecumenical versus these early church council gatherings, the idea of any kind of leadership is extremely vague up until Constantine. So there's one thing that Constantine does. He gets everybody in lockstep-ish, all on board with the same agenda, so to speak. Yeah. Which,
Do you think that's what they would have asked them? Are you in lockstep-ish?
no, that's my vernacular. Yeah. Oh, you're gonna say something.
Well, no, it seems to me we assume a monolithic Christianity.
Yeah, that's always existed since
Right.
Jesus.
Right.
Yeah.
We assume a monolithic Trinity.
Yeah. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And yet it is so diverse. I mean, I'm just a person who needs to think about the nature of the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
And the diversity of culture, instead of it being, I don't know, European Judeo-Christianity or whatever you want to call it. Right? And always ask where in all of these locations around the Mediterranean, basically, including, again, North Africa, is very much more important than it is in our mind because of our Eurocentrism. But what is the important thing in the Egyptian area, in the Carthaginian area, what's Turkey today, and, versus Rome, versus Gaul, even of the Roman Empire, and all that. So, and those are just the first basics. Even thinking about what's going to happen around 700 when the Muslims arrive, and it's just difficult for us to, I think, relate to these councils without asking a primary question for me is how collectively did people see themselves versus our hyper-individualistic way of seeing ourselves in our time?
Yeah.
Because, for instance, Anabaptism could not have arisen apart from the hyper-individualism of the inhabitation of North America. It began in Europe, but it couldn't have blossomed with the religious wars.
Yeah.
Neither side of the religious wars would have accepted
No.
a lot of pacifism on the for me, always the questions are, what's sort of a prevailing philosophy, if you can call it that, around a certain area? What's driving that? Governments of that area. And the need for this is very, very political because of all of the conflict among not just religious people. This is about how do we get along with our neighbor at all?
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And we can easily sit here now and think, well, these are fun little hobbies for historians or whatever to
Yeah.
look back on these things.
Yeah.
But these folks this is life and death for them to say, I accept your faith. I let, again, my children can marry your children.
Yep.
We can have a future together. Now, these things aren't at all peaceful and settled. And our assumption of, there's the civic harmony anyway, to rely back upon. There is not civic harmony.
Absolutely not.
There is huge amounts of local warlords, basically, all over the place. And so I would say that the theological necessity for these things comes about just out of the simple command to love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
How do I love these people who are so darn different than me?
Yeah.
And who say antithetical things to what I do?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so settling this ideas about Jesus as the ideas evolve through hundreds of years, right? Who is God? Who is Jesus? Who is the Spirit? And all that. And how does that affect us? How does that relate to the way we are? You can't have a Christianity without this kind of attempt to reconcile.
Yeah.
Right? And so for me, people thinking, well, this is just about church governance, has nothing to do with God. It has everything to do with God.
Yeah.
As it still does, and yet people don't really want to, I think about it too much, because this is the messy part of it.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, two ideas here. In terms of the implications on the ancient world, right? And again, this is as we, 2,000 years later, are thinking about the significance of these gatherings. One of the things, we take so many things for granted in our communication, just again, I cannot emphasize that enough. The consequences of our polity, our governance, both secular and religious, the way that communication factors into that is just, again, remarkable, right? The idea that information can be transferred, the idea that we in the Oregon Synod can elect a new bishop after, 3 to 7 ballots, depending on who keeps their name on, even though it's all over. The fact that somebody in Michigan can hear about that 5 minutes later, right? Because the Oregon Synod had put out a press release or sent an email or whatever. There might have been a representative of the Michigan Synod, one of the Michigan Synod.
Somebody's using their phone during.
Yeah, absolutely. Just this idea that information can be spread so quickly affects governance and polity and all that jazz. In the ancient world, right, you are dealing with hyper-localized issues because Montanism might not have spread beyond this locality, right? And so you're, again, just using Montanism as an example. But one of the things to think about is when we think about things like heresies, I think the image that we have in our brain is like an infection, right? As if something, as a pustulant growth within the community. But that's not what heresies were. These were not, by and large, bad actors trying to create division and dissension within the community. A heresy is simply an idea that didn't win. That's all it is. That's all it is. Is that as Paul was saying, what we're witnessing in these councils is the evolution and the growth of not just church polity, but of theology, of who God is. Right? The idea that Jesus is divine, is one member of the Trinity. The idea of the Trinity. These things don't pop out of Christianity on the year 31. Okay? In fact, these things are evolving, occurring, growing through that entire first century into the second century. And even then, you've got people who are like, that's Trinity? What are you talking about? That's polytheistic. That's a load of malarkey. Explain it to me. Sorry. And they go this way, right? How they're heretics. Again, going back to the filioque, right? Or any of the other, Latin-named theological descendants that occur within the church over history. These are simply people going, well, no, it's this way. And the other people are going, well, no, it's this way. And that way wins, and this way becomes heresy, right? It's just, it's just the way the world works. But this is how what we have, within Lutheranism right now, what we have within our theology is, it's evolved over time, right? In fact, if you were to contrast Luther's theology on certain subjects with the ELCA's, we disagree. Straight up, disagree. And that's okay? Here's the thing that I also heard Paul talking about, which is important in this conversation as well, too, is that in an era of quote-unquote non-denominationalism, we actually have a great schism therein, which is, and again, this is not, you're heretics because you disagree. I'm not condemning or anything. but there's a big difference in thinking about what church means. So, taking our denomination, right, which is an invented word to describe the idea, taking our tradition, we are heavily congregationally based, meaning that for the most part, our church gets to do what it wants to do without anybody telling them what to do, right? If the bishop steps in, something's gone wrong, and it's usually by invitation, not intervention, okay? However, we take for granted the fact that we have these, that you can go to an ELCA church in Portland, Oregon, and you can go to an ELCA church in, Worcester, Massachusetts, and take for granted that it's going to be relatively similar. However, don't take for granted that there's also going to be some very important geographical and local differences amongst that. But we all agree to be church together, right? Which is, again, it's remarkable when you go to something like the Oregon Synod Gathering. You have churches from, urban Portland and churches from Prineville and Burns and, 6 hours away from us in an entirely different geographical and cultural context. And we all get together and we're like, okay, I've erased the synod, we're gonna continue to walk together this year.
Not about guns.
Yeah, not on specific topics, but by and large. Think about that in terms of 66 synods spread across the United States. When we convene our church-wide gathering, I grew up in Michigan, I served in Indiana, I went to school in Minnesota, and now I serve in Oregon. The difference in the synod gathering from Oregon to Indiana is great. The IK synod is dealing with entirely different questions than we are the majority of the year. We take so many things for granted. For example, thinking about the resolutions that were on the floor, this year there was one, and Matt helped me remember here, there was one reaffirming our support of immigrant communities. There was one reaffirming our support of LGBTQ communities in light of conversations around trans and all that jazz. But by and large, there wasn't much conflict aside from deciding what the rules of the assembly were going to be, and that had to do more with the polity and less with the politics. I only spent 4 years in the IK Synod, so I went to 3 Synod assemblies during that time. And you can't keep in mind, I was ordained in 2009, so this was in the wake of the sexuality statement. Many of the things that we were dealing with were heresy, not heresy per se, but congregations that were like, we don't want to be here anymore. We're going the other direction because you all are heretics, right? You all approve gay people, so see you later, bye. And we're dealing with just really hyper-local stuff. Like I'm trying to remember specific examples, but I remember just being bored to tears sometimes because I'm like, it's not applied to the ministry at all, but I understand it's really important for that local congregation to know where God bless, Godspeed. But we take that for granted. Contrast that with, again, out of this hyper-individualistic context and culture that we have in the West, churches that are Lord to themselves, right? Which, and again, non-denominationalism is a blanket term. In reality, many of these churches are in networks, organic networks, where they share some leadership resources and pastors. I don't understand the full picture, but that's not my culture, my context. Somebody else would be able to use our picture. But then there are congregations that are, again, Lord unto themselves, which is we don't report to anybody. We ordain our own pastors. We decide polity and politics and what to do with our money and all that jazz amongst ourselves. No oversight, not even the IRS, really. That's a different picture. It's a very different picture, and it's one that we kind of take for granted in this modern context. And however you feel about this, in my mind, there is great benefit to having at least a cohesive conversation amongst Christianity, having an oikumene, right? Having a sense that we are walking those together. Contrast that with, well, we have our church, we have our money, we have our pastor, and we have the truth. And nobody gets to tell us otherwise. It's very different. It's very different. I have opinions about it. That's me. I'm obviously biased. I come from this. What we're studying is the attempt of Christianity to agree for 2,000 years. that's what councils are about. That's what councils are about.
And again, as it translates into today, the idea of a university, that you can gather
knowledge.
all these
Yeah.
disparate subjects
Yeah.
and say, there is unity in this knowledge, right?
Even in terms of, we talk about clergy education, we talk about seminaries, and this is one of the things that our denomination and others are struggling with, is that we used to have 9 fully functioning, physically located seminaries with entire staff on them, and now they're no longer physical, and including the largest at the time, Luther, doesn't have a physical footprint at all, right? I mean, they own some office buildings, but they no longer have a campus. Which is, hey, times change, world changes, etc. But the idea of seminary continuing to exist, which is an attempt at, semi-consistent education of clergy across the denomination, across traditions, I think is pretty important. And also the idea that your pastor has received an education that is from outside of their bucket, outside of their silo, right? One of the most important parts of the seminary process is losing your faith and reforming it. And I don't think that a lot of our modern contemporaries in these silo traditions do that. I think it's more about rubber stamping the same theology over and over and over and over again, not causing you to question yours. Let me spend the last. Go ahead. No.
Well, no,
We've got weeks to talk about this.
You bring up the foundational need here, because we have a question about whether or not we worship God,
Yeah.
or we worship our need for certitude,
Yeah. And comfort.
or we worship our wish fulfillment fantasies.
Yeah.
Or
Or whether we worship this cultural Jesus character that we created because he matches.
Right, well, the one with the assault rifle.
Yes, the one with the assault rifle.
I like it. Right?
Yeah.
So, the control of information, and how is that possible in different places?
Oh yeah.
The attempt to actually create silos of information. As in every governance system that is foundational.
Yes.
You have to have a priesthood and a police force.
Yes.
You can call it many different things, but people don't get that there's always in the hierarchy of power those two realities. And so the church will necessarily always, in whatever forms the church takes, will necessarily always conflict with government structures.
Yep.
And yet we don't see that as, well, I really don't want to, I really don't want to think about conflict.
Yeah.
I want to avoid conflict at all. I'm called by God to avoid all conflict. When, I think we need to have some humility around how hard it is to be an emperor. How difficult is it to govern this whole group of...
It's a heavy burden to bear.
Right, cats, not sheep. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, how are we supposed to herd them
Yeah.
and get them to go down the same road, right? And we just take for granted that God is somehow in that, but we don't define how, and we don't take sides if we can help it, right? And especially, I think especially now, we're trying to figure out, still, a few of us of my age anyway, are still trying to say, wow, what happened to that consensus? We thought there was a consensus back there. Even let's take 1980 or something like that.
Yeah.
What's happened since 1970, 1980, 1990? And we need, I think, to identify that we are in an exile situation, diaspora situation, whatever you want to call it, with regard to the assumptions of the 1950s, 60s, 70s about something called the church, as if there was a church to have a church-state separation from. And so, I know I'm talking all over the place, but it just occurs to me over and over that we just live on assumptions. We don't
Yeah.
live much in terms of actual dialogue
Yeah.
with ourselves, much less with others around these things. Because most people can't be bothered to think in these terms.
Yeah.
They just assume, well, now that I have the truth, I'm a Mooney and I have the truth.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
a Lutheran, I have the truth. Now that I have the truth, I don't have to listen to you.
Yeah. Because I found it.
Well, God isn't
I
calling
found
me.
the pearl in
God
the
is not
field.
calling me to talk to a heretic,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I've labeled you a heretic, and therefore my tribe's right, yours is wrong.
Done.
In the
Done deal.
discussion. And
I'm going to heaven, you're going to hell.
And
Done deal for you.
the great thing is my tribe has nuclear power.
Yeah.
Which doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Amen to that.
We can't even decide amongst ourselves what time zone we want to be in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or what time it is right now.
Yeah, what
Yeah.
time it is right now, yeah.
Well, and again, just to follow up and really contemporize this, what I mentioned at Cast Sundays, one of the conversations that we've been hearing for time immemorial is the idea of the United States as a Christian nation. And the question is, which Christianity,
Yeah.
Exactly.
right? Which Christianity are we talking about here? Because,
Yeah.
again, I don't think that such a thing does or can exist. I think those are like,
What do people think is where did they get that?
Susan, that's a whole other class.
I can't
They-
figure out where they get it.
Well, okay. I'll give you my 30-second answer. It's a genie. They wished for it and created it ex nihilo.
That's so.
Like a lot of our current loci of conflict in our country. These things have been manufactured specifically because they grant people power. So the idea of a Christian nation has been fabricated in order to create divisions within the populace such that one gains power and the other is seen as heretics. I mean, that's humans. Warren,
But how much of this also changes because of the changes in our society?
Oh,
Because our society,
all of it does.
it dramatically changed.
All of it does.
Yeah, that's what I mean about our assumptions from 1980.
Yeah, all of it does. I mean, and again, we can track this within even the councils that are going up until Constantine. Okay, here's a prime example. So we're talking about the early councils. So the first council is Jerusalem, 50-ish. The next recorded council, or attempt at a council, next synod, is 155 in Rome. We don't really know what it's about. Nobody took notes. Robert's Rules was not in effect. They didn't have a good secretary. There was no minutes from that meeting. But anecdotally, several historians and different documents have referred to the synod in Rome. Why in Rome? Because Rome had become the de facto center of Christianity at that point because it was the center of the empire. That's it. It's like, why is Portland the center of Oregon? Because that's where the people are, right? That's it. The next recorded synod isn't until 193. In 193, there's also the Council of Ephesus. What are either of these synods about? No idea. We know things that were going on theologically during that time. We can conjecture as to what they might have been about, but we don't have the minutes from the meeting. However, the year 193 is also the year of the 5 emperors, where you have, which one gets assassinated? Commodus, Emperor Commodus was murdered on New Year's Eve. And over the course of 193, you have 5 different emperors claiming to be emperor. And you can see the 5 coins that were minted of all these different emperors. And it ultimately results in a civil war. Does this directly cause these councils of Rome? But no, maybe not. But it's what was going on in the empire at that time. It's a period of great disturbance in the force, a period of conflict, a period of social unrest, a period of economic unrest, and so it's probably not a coincidence that you've got 2 different councils in 2 different areas of Asia Minor that occur in that same year. So what are they talking about at their councils in 193? I don't know, maybe theological issues. They're also maybe talking about what the heck to do, depending on who's in charge at that time period. Compare and contrast that with, again, not to make it politically based, but the Oregon Synod in spring of 2024. I'll just tell you that many of the conversations that were had around that were, what are going to be the impacts of the second Trump presidency upon the things that we're invested in, especially in including Lutheran Community Services, which does immigration outreach. Okay, so politics affects church and vice versa. And yes, right, society changes over time. Society changes significantly by the time you get to the era of Constantine. And the fact that Christians can walk freely in the streets without getting, rounded up and stoned and can wear symbols of their faith. Not to mention what the symbols of faith are, right? Because early on the symbol of faith is the Cairo or the pikes of the fish, and later on the cross is adopted by post-Constantine maybe. What does Constantine put in the shield? Probably not a cross, probably Cairo, but the cross wins out in the end. All of these things, they don't happen in the year 31, right? They happen. Nobody's wearing crosses around their necks in the year 31. Nobody's wearing,
Yet the assumption of each group holding the truth about God is that we were established in AD 31.
We were.
The rest of you, I don't know what you've been doing.
I don't know what you guys are up to,
but you're heretics. And we're not.
Every single one of you. Where did I got too many things open. Nope. Council of Rome, that's not what I wanted. Hold on. I've got too many tabs open and I accidentally clicked away from the one that I have, which has my list of early councils. Okay, so these two, what time is it? 10:29. We're going to get to the Council of Carthage. And then we'll pause and we'll come back next week and talk more about these. So the next significant council that happens is the Council of Carthage in 251. Okay? And the thing about, well, we already talked about the Council of Carthage, or about Council of Carthage in general. But there are, okay, now I can count them, the Councils of Carthage. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 councils of Carthage between 251 and 525. Okay, so over about, 300 years? Yeah, 300 years, something like that. There are 9 councils of Carthage. In and of itself, that doesn't say anything, right? There's not necessarily a meta point to be made there, but it does invite several questions around, including, why are people meeting in Carthage so much? And there's no silver bullet answer to it. It's, again, it invites imagination, invites questions, invites wondering. One reason might be because it's in Africa. We talk about regional differences in polity and theology within the United States. Can you imagine that there might have been regional differences in polity and theology in the early Christian church? Paul just got talking about that. Carthage represents, we again, talk about things changing over time. When we think of Africa in a modern day setting, we often refer to third world countries, right? Egypt was the center of the world. Where was the big library? It was in Egypt. Where was the Septuagint translated? In Egypt, right? Where were most centers of learning and higher education? In North Africa, right? So why is Carthage the place where we have a ton of church councils? Because that's where everybody was when they weren't in Rome. All right? Israel was kind of a forgotten location by this point in time. Again, another thing we take for granted, this idea that Israel, especially by the time you get to the Crusades, right? We need to recapture the Holy Land. It's like, what does the Holy Land even mean at that point? It's like, it's just a symbol. It's not even, there's nothing there, right? Debatable. And I'll just rattle them off real quick. So you've got 251, 256, 345, 397. These dates are actually important if you think about them in the long run. We will talk about 411, 418, 419. So what was happening in 411, 418, 419? Talk about that. 484, and finally 525. Also, one of my favorite things is the one in 484 is often referred to the Vandal Synod of Carthage, specifically because it was an unsuccessful attempt at a church meeting that was called by the Vandal king Huneric to persuade the Nicene bishops to convert to Arian Christianity. So, even some of the councils that were convened were themselves heretical councils, but that's a different topic. So let's talk just real quickly. 251. It's called under the presidency of Cyprian to consider the treatment of lapsy. Lapsy. This is going to be another important one. We talked about this in early Christian history. Okay. Anybody want to take a stab at what the lapsy are?
Those whose faith is lapsed.
Yeah. Anybody refer to themselves or know anybody as calls themselves a lapsed Catholic? Right? It's almost like a cultural term, right? And sometimes it's a joke. Well, I'm genetically Catholic.
I used to think that.
Yeah, I'm a lapsed Catholic, meaning I still identify as being a Catholic, but I don't really go to church anymore, right? We don't, for whatever reason, we don't refer to lapsed Lutherans or whatever. I don't know. Lapsed Lutherans, I guess, are just Catholics. I don't know. All right. Anyway, the lapsy are the people who publicly recounted their faith. Recanted, not recounted. Recanted their faith. And again, you'll remember in our study of early Christian history that there were several different periods throughout, especially the 3rd century, wherein one of the emperors said, if you're Christian, you're going to get thrown in jail, and who knows what happens. If you don't want to get thrown in jail, you simply have to sign a piece of paper recanting your faith and carry that around with you as proof that you have recanted your faith. One of these periods happens after, we're talking about the year 251 here. One of these major periods happens after, toward the end of the 3rd century, into the 4th century. That is during the reign of Galerius, I think. One of the tetrarchs that ends up being the kind of the catalyst that results in Constantine. We'll talk about the history later. But this is the make Rome great again guy. And he pushes this hardcore. Well, the problem is once that period of persecution ends, and Christianity can kind of rear its head, poke their head above the sand again. Now the communities have to figure out what they're going to do with the people that recanted their faith. And again, from a modern perspective, this idea of that seems strange and yet not strange, but just, again, think about the consequences for that in terms of, let's say you decide not to recant, and you don't get arrested, but your family loses their business. Now it's 5 years later, things have gotten easy again, and your neighbor who recanted their faith and might own your property walks back in the church and is like, hey guys, hey, I missed you the past 5 years. What do you do with that? Well, that's why the Council of Carthage is called, because they, as not an ecumenical gathering, but as the area of Carthage, they're trying to figure out what we do with these people. And effectively to decide them on probation. Wherein it really depends on whether they're now willing to re-recant or unrecant. Yeah, not re-recant.
Well, and still, they're going to be rhinos, right?
Yes, right, yeah.
Lutherans in name only, whatever you want to
Yeah, right.
Right, yeah. And there will always be these distrusts going on. And so how does one even repent to a group?
Yeah.
To be rehabilitated?
Yeah.
I mean, what kind of re-education camp do we send you to?
Right.
We send you to do we send you to your confirmation class?
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah. No, not the one that taught you that stuff. We send you to our confirmation class, which follows Luther's small catechism closely, right? And makes you memorize these things so you don't forget the next time.
Did you pass the national test?
Yeah, did you pass the national test? Yeah. And so what ends up happening with the lapsy is basically they put them on probation, and the consequences of their lapsing depend on the severity of their guilt. So it's on a case-by-case basis, which is essentially the Synods way of saying, we'll let churches deal with it on their own, okay? But then they convene synods again in 252 and 254, coming back to the same issue. Because you've got probably unique cases that are rearing their head and they're having to deal with it and decide, well, this community is dealing with that. But what they end up doing is they end up forwarding their decision onto the Council of Rome, who says, okay, we approve. Because Rome is effectively the de facto center of Christianity at that point in time, not officially, but in
Right. When the message gets there.
When the message gets there.
When they get around to it.
when they get around to it, well, the next council in Rome doesn't happen
Right.
much later. Anyways,
You know, Jesse,
yeah.
so what was the mechanism for getting the word out that they're even having like these? How does everybody get there?
Top down, letters, right? I mean, the way, something to think about is that a lot of Paul's letters are basically the replacement for ecumenical councils,
Yeah.
right? Because what Paul's doing is Paul is writing to churches in conflict. Again, not a church. Like when we're talking about Galatia, we're talking about, the group of churches. When we're talking about Rome, we're talking about a group of churches. Paul's saying, here's how you deal with that. Here is my official decision, blah, blah, blah. Which is, in fact, doing the same thing, okay? But the way you would disseminate information is the way anything gets disseminated, which is by messenger, by letter, by people traveling. Because again, looking at how apostles, disciples travel from church to church, which is another thing that we have evidence of in the epistles, right? I, Paul, am sending Timothy, or who are we reading about Galatia? It wasn't Timothy, it was the other guy. Barnabas? No? Maybe, anyway. Right? So you're sending leaders from one church to another. Somebody's moving. It happens slowly, right, relative to social media, but probably a lot quicker than we might expect. But yeah, there's no Facebook. You're probably not posting these publicly. Maybe? I don't know. I don't necessarily know what Carthage looks like in terms of persecution. It's far from remote, so by and large, not too bad. Alright folks, thanks. This is going to be fun. I'm looking forward to talking about Montanism and Donatism and Arianism and all these wonderful things which we'll get into next time.
Leave the tables and chairs up. People love that camp.
Right.
Oh, I'd be helpful to
Just keep it.
Yeah, just like the 7 big councils.
7 big ones.
Yes,
Yeah, absolutely.